Fine morning to hear from two excellent speakers on the subject of groundwater appropriations. It seems altogether fitting when we are on the cusp, if not already in, another drought in this state, to hear about the management of water quantity in Minnesota. The Minnesota Department of Natural Resources is responsible for managing water quantity throughout the state for both groundwater and surface waters. And our speakers today, both from the Minnesota DNR, help run the state's water appropriation program. Dan Miller is a water use consultant in the Division of Ecological and Water Resources at the Minnesota DNR. He's a project manager for the North and East Metro Groundwater Management Area and works on the White Bear Lake Ramsey County District Court case. Prior to joining the DNR, Dan worked in the natural resources field for 10 plus years for local and state governments, including 4 years in the MPCA's stormwater program. Dan has degrees in mass communications and in natural resources conservation. Our other speaker is Ellen Considine from the DNR as well, started her career sampling and gauging streams at the U.S. Geological Survey in Wisconsin. She moved on to work as a groundwater modeler, field geologist, and project manager in consulting. And since joining the Minnesota DNR in 2015, she's focused on areas of Minnesota where groundwater sustainability and groundwater depletion of surface waters are concerns. Ellen has a Master's of Science in Hydrogeology and a BS in Geological Engineering. Dan and Ellen are going to tell us about the state's water appropriation regulatory program, drought responsibilities and management over the last 2 years, and then share an example of how DNR is responding to and managing water availability in areas where disadvantaged people and communities are being impacted by high capacity water appropriation. Dan and Ellen, take it away. The floor is yours.
All right, thanks, Mark, for that great introduction. It's good to see some familiar names in the participant list. So hi to all of you that we worked with years ago. So again, I'm Dan Miller. I'm a water use consultant with the DNR and our water regulations unit, which is within our conservation assistance and regulations section in the Division of Ecological Water Resources. So buried in what we call EWR at the DNR. Again, we're going to be talking a little bit about water appropriation, our drought response, and then Ellen's going to share an example as Mark mentioned. So I'm going to get into it. I'm going to overview some of our water appropriation law basics, touch on the 2021 and 2022 drought, again, our regulatory responsibilities in these areas, and then Ellen's going to talk about the interferences out of water situations that have been experienced over the last couple of years, and in particular, look at one area of the state where disadvantaged folks are being impacted by high capacity appropriation. So let me step back a little bit in history to understand our regulatory program and water appropriation. So it goes back to the 1920s and 30s when many of you are probably familiar with and have heard about the Dust Bowl. And so this area in central US that's shaded in kind of the brown color is where really extensive drought conditions existed for those 2 decades. It did spread into Minnesota. The photo on the right is a farmer east of Appleton in Swift County in 1936. It's from the Minnesota Historical Society. And you can see he's sifting through the soil there where he had just planted that spring, a corn crop that's destroyed by drought in 1936. And so Minnesota certainly felt the effects of those droughty decades. And what happens, right, when we have crisis situations, when we have really challenging, catastrophic events, especially environmental. I think many of you are aware what happens is then we have policy. right? And so in 1937, then the legislature established a policy in the state of Minnesota to conserve, protect, and utilize the water resources of the state. So this directed the Department of Conservation at the time, as we were known, um, to manage, conserve, and like I said, protect, but yet utilize the water resources of the state. And so statutes and rules were developed. The permitting system came about where the DNR was regulating the use and appropriation of both surface water and groundwaters of the state. And the overarching goal of now 103G, it was in a different section in our statutes previously, is to manage water resources to meet long-term needs of competing uses. Right, so even in 1937, our legislature and folks that were managing water quantities and aware of the concerns based on that drought period in the 20s and 30s, that we had competing uses for water. We needed to conserve and protect, but we knew folks, businesses, people, farmers needed to use that water. A little bit more on our water use law and policies in the state. It can't go without saying more of how this is really a balancing act between the use of the water, but also protecting those same resources. So, for example, a lot of our groundwater resources, right, seep into surface waters, whether that's wetlands or rare features like calcareous fens. Trout streams, right, receive really cool, clean groundwater in many areas of the state that provide important habitat, fisheries, et cetera. And so it's this balance between recognizing we can authorize the use of water, but we need to protect those resources for current and future generations, but also other sensitive resources and natural resources that depend on that same water. In Minnesota, we're known as a riparian rights state. And so what that means is if you're abutting a stream, a lake, river, wetland, or if you own land overlying groundwater, you have a right to use that water. And everyone, all landowners, have an equal right to use the water. No one gains a greater right through prior use. So this is unlike Western water law, which is also known as the prior appropriation, where in Western US, you'll hear this a lot. Parties who obtain water rights essentially put their intake into a surface water before anybody else does, is the highest priority then in times of shortages, meaning they will be the last to be curtailed in shortages, right? So that's Western US. And in Minnesota, we share those water resources. We allocate equitably among those users. And in time of shortages, I'm going to talk about the allocation priorities in law. It's really those non-essential uses that are curtailed first, and I'm going to talk about that and what those are right now. So again, first highest priority in Minnesota is domestic water supplies, including power production and water uses for power production that has a contingency plan, essentially a backup to that surface water use. Most of our power facilities use surface water, and so in times of shortages, they would also be protected as long as they have a backup, whether that's treated wastewater, groundwater use, et cetera. But domestic supplies, known as our top priority in the state. Second in our allocation priorities are consumptive uses less than 10,000 gallons per day. 10,000 gallons per day is significant because that's what requires a permit. If you're pumping more than 10,000 gallons a day, you need a permit from the DNR to pump that amount of water. And so this typically is for like farm hobby use, some permitted uses that may be under 10,000 gallons a day or over our annual limit or low kind of level of our permitting threshold of 1 million gallons a year. So you might be less than 10,000 a day, but over 1 million. It's generally those smaller uses of water, that are in our second priority. Third is agricultural irrigation and ag processing. So our legislature, when they established these allocation priorities in statute, recognized that farming and agriculture is important in the state, and it's the third highest. And I'm going to talk about why this order is significant. Fourth is that power production that doesn't have the contingency plan, right, and a preparation for a backup in times of shortages. But most do. But again, that is in there as our fourth priority, highest priority. Fifth is commercial and industrial water uses. That's really most of our other permitted uses across the state. And then sixth is what we call non-essential use. So that's your lawn and landscape irrigation, swimming pool filling, car washing, those things that, we want, right? But in times of shortages, we don't need. And so those are the first to be restricted in times of shortages. So if we don't have enough water for our domestic supplies at any one point, we would curtail that first lowest priority, the lawn and landscape irrigation, swimming pool filling, right, car washing, until we could fulfill those domestic supplies. If they still don't have enough water, we would curtail the commercial industrial then. If we were in a significant drought and we couldn't supply enough water, we would just keep working up these allocation priorities during times of shortages, curtailing that use. Now, we wouldn't maybe necessarily need to curtail complete use from all those permitted entities, but we certainly would want some reductions from those uses. And again, in order to protect those higher priority users. So I've already touched on this. So appropriation use of surface water or groundwater requires a permit from the DNR if you're pumping in excess of 10,000 gallons per day or 1,000,000 gallons per year. We have a permitting process system online called MPARS. That's the Minnesota DNR Permitting and Reporting System. It's a web-based system similar to what PCA and others use for permitting, and in our case, reporting water use annually as well. And as I've mentioned, our highest priority of protecting drinking water is the most important. We're protecting and conserving those natural resources, but we also know we need to provide those same water availability for not only our current, but future generations as well. And that's outlined in statute, some really clear statute provisions that describe that. Okay, drought. Let's back up to 2020, fall of 2020. If you're in northeastern Minnesota in the Arrowhead area, really 2019 was really dry, and water levels in that area and flows were dropping and were fairly low in 2019. But primarily leading up to the 2021 seasonal period of drought, 2020, the fall was relatively dry. We didn't really get any snow throughout much of Minnesota right before the holidays in December. And then the snowpack was reasonable, certainly not as much as we had this past winter season, but it commenced really in March 2021. And most lakes were ice-free by early April of 2021. When June arrived, if you remember, I remember because we're certainly in this, quite a bit at the DNR in our program, and it was hot and dry quick in June. And we saw then stream flows beginning to drop, water levels in lakes beginning to drop quickly because of the intense June of heat and dry period. By mid-August 2021 was when the drought was at its peak for most of the season, and many areas experienced significant droughty conditions. We saw land subsidence in northwestern Minnesota. Maybe you recall that news story over near the Red River. Dust storms in the spring in northwestern Minnesota from our staff that were working in that part of the state, and peat fires as well in 2021. So here's the U.S. Drought Monitor map from August 24th, 2021, that depicts really the worst of the drought. That band of dark kind of red, brownish color is the exceptional drought category. And that was the first time that had occurred in Minnesota since the U.S. Drought Monitor was established in the early 2000s. So, nearly 20 years of that not occurring. Many other areas of the state, as you can see, we're experiencing severe drought designation, which is that orange shading. And then our climatology group, the DNR, was busy evaluating the weekly changes in 2021, helping to inform decisions relating to drought response throughout the year. We had plenty of complaints from landowners, particularly folks trying to get their boat off their lift, in the fall, trying to remove it out of the access because water levels had dropped so far below that access pad, that concrete pad typically. We had folks irrigating from lakes and then complaining about their neighbors, and the lake's so low that they were pumping water out of the lake. How can they do that? So a lot of our staff responding to complaints about flows and water levels in general. We did get some rain in late August, early September that started to alleviate some of the flows throughout the state. Another part of what we do at the DNR is manage stream flows. So as part of our responsibility for water quantity management throughout the state, we need to implement restrictions when flows are below certain thresholds that we've established throughout the state. And so we had a number of temporary permit suspensions that we needed to implement. And you can see the locations of where those permits were located throughout the state with that map on the left. And again, these are all surface water appropriators, most of them agricultural crop irrigators that are pumping surface water, or golf courses, or landscape and athletic field irrigation. We manage those watershed flows at the Huck 8 level. And some of you folks know where those stream gauges are, and so we appreciate the ease of just clicking on the website to get that real-time flow data to help us make those decisions. We use a minimum threshold called the Q90, which is a value that demonstrates those flows in any record of time that occur 10% in that record. And so those are the minimum flows that we have determined in the 82 watersheds across the state. And we use that information weekly, daily, especially in drought conditions, to then help us inform when we need to temporarily suspend those surface water appropriators from pumping, because we need to protect those in-stream uses, fish and wildlife habitat, sometimes drinking water supplies that are downstream of those high capacity appropriators pumping from a surface water. And then also the law says we need to, in some cases, manage the availability for navigation. So we suspended in that summer 248 surface water appropriation permits. Again, most of them ag crop irrigation or irrigation related, as I mentioned earlier. We reviewed a total of 517 permits, and then we make decisions, again, based on the type of use. So if they're returning flows to the stream, we wouldn't suspend that. It's consumptive uses that we are suspending, obviously. Again, rain arrived late summer, early fall. We were able to reinstate 200 of these 248 that we suspended by November because of the increase in precipitation in the fall. And then the 48 remainder that still were suspended through the winter and remained suspended through the winter, we were able to reinstate in the spring of 2022 due to snow melt and then spring rains in 2022. Again, flows improved that helped us then reinstate those permits. We had a number of out of water situations. We call those well interferences. And that occurs when a high capacity appropriation, in these cases in 2021, was an agricultural irrigator pumping groundwater, removes water from the aquifer that they share with the domestic well owner. The domestic well owner is then unable to access that water for their home domestic needs. And we received 53 complaints in 2021, only 24 completed a complaint form, and that was within 6 counties across the state. And again, all of them due to agricultural crop irrigation, pumping in a same aquifer, similar aquifer that's connected to where that domestic well was located. And then, really what happens here is that, agriculture irrigation, as you can imagine, is typically located in those areas where there's sandy soils. And then those crops obviously demanding water, especially in these times of drought conditions. And then that aquifer pumping obviously impacting those other domestic wells nearby. And so we have a process where we resolve those situations. We had 9 out of that 24 that were found valid. So our staff do some technical work to determine the validity of those complaints and determine who was at fault from the high capacity pumpers. And then we have a settlement process to resolve that issue where the high capacity appropriators typically paying for the cost to restore the water supply, whether that's constructing a new well, dropping more drop pipe, adding more drop pipe, or lowering the pump. We had 5 of those complaints were actually resolved early by the high capacity irrigator, right? So those folks obviously recognized I put my neighbor out of water and I'm going to take care of that for them. I just want to touch on over appropriation that occurred in 2021. We had some that, again, they self-report annually to us about the amount of water they pumped monthly over the course of the entire year. So most of this is seasonal appropriation that typically over appropriated, again, likely due to the drought, like I described earlier, and the demands that their crop need. We had over 1,000 permit holders that reported in excess of their authorized volume. So we set volumes on permits to say you can only pump this amount based on our analysis of the application, the demand and the availability of the aquifer, and the type of crop, et cetera, soils, et cetera. All those things go into that limit on their permit. Well, we had 1,000 in 2021 that over appropriated. Unique here is that in law, it says you need to be within 10% of accuracy when you report the amount of water you use. So when I say 720 permit holders use more than 10% of their authorized volume, that's significant because, again, law allows this kind of window of you need to be within 10% of accuracy. That equates to 7% of our active permits, the 720 then, that were over that 10% window. 536 of those permit holders, were ag crop irrigators, and they reported using an additional 6.2 billion gallons of water. The next most common use type was livestock watering, and so livestock facilities are using it for sanitation, cooling, and drinking for their livestock, whether it's cows, right, beef cattle, poultry, etc. There's 35 permittees, and they reported in excess of 235,000 gallons collectively, in excess of their authorized volume. 20 public water suppliers, that's what the PWS stands for, public water supplier permits, reported in excess of 794,000 gallons. So significantly less, obviously, than our ag crop irrigated permit holders collectively reporting. And so what do we do generally with this information? One thing that came out of some of this awareness and work is that we have some new legislation that was passed this year to give us some more tools to compel compliance in these situations. We currently have an administrative penalty order we can use, but it's pretty specific to unpermitted pumping. So we do have some new tools that we'll be able to consider when we have egregious and repetitive violations. And just in comparison, 2015 water use, which is closer to the more normal year, we had 189 permits over appropriated. That was 2% of our active permits at that time. 125 permits used more than the 10% window that they're allowed to use. Again, 1.3% of our active permits. Still, the majority there were ag crop irrigation, 42. Next use type with the most number of permits over appropriating was livestock watering with 11. And then we had some golf course irrigators, landscape athletic field irrigation, and municipal public water suppliers. So just wanted to give you some perspective on what we would consider a little bit more of a normal water year and, the significance of 2021 and the over appropriation. We haven't gone through the full 2022 data that's been reported to us yet. We look forward to seeing and doing some QA/QC on that data. And then certainly looking at it a little bit more closely as it relates to 2021. And again, obviously the permitted authorized volumes and the next steps in communication that we need to share with our permit holders about compliance. A couple additional items I want to touch on here. We also are required to implement a drought plan. So this guides our preparedness, response, communication during the drought. The map on the left shows the major watersheds that help guide DNR communication. Drought plan identifies 5 different stages of drought, including non-drought, drought watch, drought warning, restrictive, and emergency phase. And so these phases of drought help us communicate water user restrictions, implementation of water efficiency and conservation strategies during the different phases of the drought. So depending on the industry and the drought intensity, the plan and phases help determine actions by those water users, including local water suppliers like public water suppliers, for example, enacting restrictions at the local level. The drought watch phase is stimulated by a significant portion of the watershed is abnormally dry or moderate. So here at the end of June, you can see, for example, the Lake Superior. I don't know if you can see my cursor, I apologize. But the Lake Superior basin here is mostly in that abnormally dry. So that's where they're in that watch phase. And we would communicate then to the local suppliers, water suppliers, about implementing educational communication type strategies at that first level. Warning phase commences when a significant portion of the watershed is in a severe drought. And so that would be that orange color. So down here in southern Minnesota, or up here in that northwestern portion. The warning phase also commences when the Mississippi River near Anoka, so that gauge at Anoka, or I think now it's called Brooklyn Park, is below 2,000 CFS for 5 days. And then there's the restrictive phase when a significant portion of the watershed is in extreme drought, or the Mississippi River near Anoka, Brooklyn Park, is below 1,500 CFS for 5 days. So the plan really outlines some of those steps that need to occur. And then here's just a quick map of where we sent those notifications and kind of the timeline in 2021. So Western Lake Superior District, Western Lake Superior Basin was the first watershed that we notified, and they were already in the warning phase there, right? So it was escalating so quickly that by the time we were able to notify and get some of that information out and share that with local water suppliers, they were in their warning phase. And so they had specific recommendations to implement there. The Red River and Rainy River basins were the second watershed in 2021 that we notified. They were already in extreme conditions, as you can remember from that map. The Minnesota watershed, those are those orange dots. So those are all the communities that we notify, the public water suppliers, about the conditions. They were the third group, and they were in the watch phase at that time. And then the Upper Miss in those blue dots are where those public water suppliers are located, and we inform them about the warning phase that they were in at that time. And again, suggested and recommended actions that they need to take to conserve, be more efficient with their water use, to protect those supplies for downstream users, fish and wildlife habitat, other domestic supplies, etc. There's also a drought task force that we need to implement, and that gathered for the first time in 2021 since 2012. They met July through October, includes agency reps across the state and interested organizations to share, coordinate, and plan for changing conditions during the drought. Participants share their information with each other on the respective response to the drought and share ideas on mitigating effects of low water levels and flows, and then modifying their practices, right, to adapt to the conditions. We shared current drought status information during those meetings, including permit restrictions and any well interferences or out of water issues that were being experienced across the state. So on the 2022, it was a slower build, but certainly had 2021 influence, certainly impacted more the southern half of the state. We still had a number of well interference complaints in excess of 150 in 2022, primarily due to one water supplier pumping from wells unauthorized under their permit in the North Metro area. However, we didn't suspend any surface water suspensions, and that's because the flows and water levels throughout the state kind of gradually declined, and so we did not suspend. You know, the significance in the spring of 2022 was really wild. I don't know if anybody remembers, but along that Canadian border, they had significant, nearly catastrophic, right, flooding coming off of 2021 that was extremely dry up there. So very, very different conditions in northern Minnesota, especially on that border, from really dry to flooding in the spring of 2022. And so it just was a different season in 2022. Here's the worst of it. November 8th, 2022, that swath from the Twin Cities down to Marshall area with extreme drought conditions. 85% of the state, though, at that time still experienced some form of drought, with the exception, obviously, of the Arrowhead region. We did have low lake and river levels. And again, no suspensions in 2022, really because the lows were experienced near the end of September and October, when generally those permit holders using water for irrigation, right, are preparing for winterization, right, reducing use at that time. And so the value of, administratively suspending permits really didn't necessitate the need to do the suspensions. So here's the current status. This map was just published today, June 8th. The work's done on June 6th. Our state climatologist is part of this development in Minnesota. So we did not have much drought, except for the exception of southwest Minnesota, shortly after we lost snowmelt. And so it's changed since, early May, end of April, pretty significantly. And you can see some portions there in East Central now are beginning to get into the moderate drought category, and a couple other spots as well. Forecast continues to look dry, and so DNRs continue to watch stream gauges, respond to potential, and be prepared for any out of water complaints or well interferences. And again, prepare other communications about drought with both the public and our permitted water users. I am going to stop sharing, and then Ellen will share her content. Let me get back here. Stop. There we go.
Okay. Can everybody see the screen? You should see the same screen that Dan was just sharing. That's not it.
Yep, I can see it, Ellen. Yep.
You can see it? Good deal. Thank you. Okay. Well, thanks, Dan. That was a great intro. I'm a groundwater supervisor at the Minnesota DNR, and I'm going to talk about drought and specifically how it relates to groundwater and people who depend on groundwater. So Dan showed you this map, so this might look familiar. This shows the 2021 drought at about its peak, which was in late August of 2021. And I've gone ahead and added these blue triangles. The blue triangles show where we received well interference complaints during 2021. So as Dan mentioned, 24 people submitted well interference complaint forms, and those are at the locations shown here. And you'll notice that most of the well interference complaints coincide with the areas of worst drought, which is not a surprise. And Dan mentioned this briefly, but I just wanted to show you a visual for it. Many of you might know what a well interference is. I'll just explain it really briefly, just in case you don't. A well interference occurs when pumping from one well, typically a deeper well, lowers the water level in the aquifer. So you can see our starting water level is the dashed blue line, and then the solid blue is the lowered water level. And in this case, the water level is lowered enough that it's been drawn below the pump in that other well. So this well is now out of water, and this is what we call a well interference. At the DNR, we receive far more well interference complaints during drought years than we do in wet years. But I really want you to understand that drought or lack of rainfall isn't what causes most of those wells to go out of water. It takes months or years, depending on where you are in Minnesota, for groundwater to recharge. So that means a drought of a few months doesn't have a big immediate impact on groundwater levels. What we find is that groundwater pumping to keep crops and livestock alive and keeping our lawns green, that has a big impact on groundwater levels. So it's really the human response to drought, pumping a lot of groundwater, that's what causes well interference. And that's my first takeaway for today. Pumping lots of groundwater, not drought, is what causes well interference. So for example, in that slide that I showed at the beginning that showed that band of dark red across the northwest part of the state, that's where the drought was worst in 2021. We found that drought or lack of rainfall caused 1 or 2 feet of groundwater level decline in water table aquifers. We found that groundwater pumping in that part of the state caused around 25 feet of water level decline. Now, it does sometimes happen that an old shallow well will stop working during a drought because just that 1 or 2 feet caused by the drought was enough to put the well out of water. And so if we receive a complaint form from that well owner and we investigate, that means we dismiss the complaint because their well was not out of water because of nearby groundwater use. It was out of water because just that little bit of drawdown from the drought caused it to go out of water. If our investigation finds that high capacity pumping is what caused a well to go out of water, then the owner of the high capacity well or the appropriator is responsible for the cost of restoring a water supply. So again, just a reminder, drought causes a little bit of drawdown, like a drought of just a few months caused about 1 or 2 feet of drawdown. Pumping, depending on where you are in the state, 5 to 50 feet of drawdown in domestic wells. And so I had mentioned that the appropriator If pumping is what caused the well to go out of water, the appropriator is responsible for the cost of restoring a water supply, okay? It typically costs between $1,000 and $10,000 to repair or replace a well. It depends on whether you can just lower the pump, that might be around $1,000, or if you need to drill a whole new well, that might be $10,000. So we find that well interferences and out of water problems are hardest on people who are low income, especially if they are elderly or disabled. We've met several elderly people who ran out of water while they were nursing their spouse in hospice care at home, and they were struggling to make ends meet. $1,000, much less $10,000, was money they didn't have. And they didn't know where they would get that money to restore their water supply. We also found that a well interference can be an inordinate hardship if you're not able-bodied. So imagine if you aren't able to move stock tanks, if you aren't able to move buckets and cases of water until your well is fixed, it's unusually hard for you to be out of water. Now, there are some grants and low interest loans, but those take time, right? So we found that people ended up taking out loans, like from the bank, to drill a new well. Some, and just kind of hoping they'd be able to pay off the loan. Some drillers put in new wells just out of kindness, not knowing if they would be repaid. And we know that some households just limped by with very little water for weeks, just waiting for the irrigation season to be over and hoping the water would go out entirely. So I want to give you an example of that. This calendar shows what one family in Red Lake and Polk County experienced during August of 2021. So this is up in the northwest part of the state when the drought was at its peak. They started rationing water in late July, but a little over a week later, by early August, they were completely out of water. The particular family had spent the savings that they had to hire a driller for their grandparents who lived nearby, who also had well interference. So they didn't have any money left to hire a driller. So they were out of water for weeks. Well, they tried to figure out what they were going to do. They finally applied for a loan and they got their new well drilled a few days later. And this story isn't unique. We met another family in Grant County, this is in western Minnesota, who was out of water for most of July 2021. And they were out of water in part because the local drillers were so overwhelmed with well interferences that they couldn't get through their house right away. They too were also struggling to pay for the cost of repairing the well. And we found that not only were people out of water for a long time, but we also found out that people don't want to complain to the DNR because they don't want to upset their neighbors. So to us as regulators, we look at the law and we say, well, there's a law there. They can just complain to the DNR. That's their right. They should avail themselves of that opportunity. But in actuality, in small communities, people often don't want to complain. We met a sheriff's deputy who told us he was hesitant to ask the DNR for help because he didn't want to damage relationships in the community. We met someone who was employed by a local irrigator, and he lost his job after he complained to the DNR about going out of water. And this is why we are working really, really hard to prevent well interferences before we issue groundwater appropriations permits. Because working on well interferences after the fact, first of all, it's a lot more time consuming for DNR staff, but second, people slip through the cracks because understandably they don't want to complain. And we have found that our job is getting harder. Demand for groundwater, especially for agriculture, is increasing in the western part of the state. And I think this might be driven partially by climate change, but that's a whole other presentation. I won't get into that today. But we are finding that preventing well interferences in the western Minnesota takes a lot more work than it does in eastern Minnesota. And so this brings me to our groundwater availability map. This is on the DNR's website. And this map depicts 6 different groundwater provinces. And these different groundwater provinces have different hydrogeologic characteristics, different types of aquifers. But in general, what you need to know for today is that the provinces are ranked in order of groundwater availability. So province 1, where I'm sitting in the metro area in yellow, is pretty abundant groundwater. This is about as good as it gets in Minnesota. Province 6, out in the Arrowhead, has the least available groundwater. Today I'm focusing on Province 5. This is also called the Western Province. And so the Western Province has a little bit more groundwater available than the Arrowhead, but it is nowhere close to the aquifers in the metro area. I started out working in the aquifers in the metro area, and when I switched to working on aquifers in Western Minnesota, I kind of had to unlearn everything I knew about groundwater availability because it is so much more limited in the western part of the state. And so we found there are aquifers in groundwater province 5, to be clear, and there are aquifers that can supply enough for high capacity wells, but nowhere near as much as the aquifers in the metro and in the southeast. And now what I've done is I've added those, remember those blue triangles from the beginning that showed where we received well interference complaints? I've overlaid those on this map, and you can see that most of the well interference complaints that we received during 2021 are out in groundwater province 5. And actually 70% of the complaints were from that western province. And they occurred because in these very, very limited aquifers, more groundwater was used for agriculture than in any previous year. And farmers used the water because they needed it, right? They needed it to keep their crops and their animals alive. And we, all of us, need farmers to be able to grow crops through drought and through changing climate. Oh, I should have been clicking as I went. So the fourth takeaway for today is that as the DNR is working, especially in Western Minnesota, we need to be really cautious as we're issuing groundwater use permits because groundwater there is very limited. And this circles back to what Dan was talking about, balancing the beneficial uses of groundwater with protection of the resource, making sure that the economic growth that comes with groundwater use can occur, but also we need to be careful to make sure that there is still water available for local communities to use. So moving forward, it's going to take more time for the DNR to evaluate permits in Western Minnesota because these are such limited aquifers. We have to be really, really careful. And it's also going to require a lot more collaboration and cooperation among the groundwater users. So I wanted to circle back at the end here to just the DNR's mission, and this is what Dan spoke about. Our mission, and this is a simplified version of it, our mission is to integrate and sustain the interdependent values of a healthy environment, a sustainable economy, and livable communities. I like to emphasize that part because if you can imagine if your home is out of water, if your community is struggling to get enough water, that's not a very livable community. As with every drought, we learned a lot from 2021. And I think we learned to pump the brakes a little bit in Western Minnesota as we're evaluating groundwater appropriation permits there. It will just take more time. And that's because the aquifers are limited. It's also because in many places, the aquifers are not as well mapped as they are in the eastern part of the state. The domestic wells are not cataloged as thoroughly. And all of those facts together mean it will take us longer to evaluate permits. But we have to do it if we're going to evaluate permits in an equitable way that ensures everybody who's impacted by our decisions is included in those decisions, is considered in those decisions. And Dan, I think this is your slide. Should I hand it back to you?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, and I didn't get that. This would have been, yeah, you can see May 23, the map there. And obviously it's changed pretty significantly since then. And I would say early May, even that drought map, like I mentioned, there was hardly, just for the blip in Southwest Minnesota drought. So we are changing this spring. We'll take any questions, Mark and Brooke. Thanks again for having us.
Yeah, thanks.
Yes, well, thank you for sharing your work. And this has been very interesting discussion, and I'm sure resulted in lots of interesting discussions and meetings over at DNR. So I want to just go through the chat here to see if we've got some questions that need to be answered. So it looks like there was one originally about the 7% that Ellen, you had already addressed in the chat. And so I think the next question I see is from Mike. Were any permittees penalized for over appropriation?
Yeah, thanks, Mike. No. The only the administrative penalty order that we've used and that authority, I think that was 2014 is when we got that legislative authority to use that tool. We've used it in 2 instances, once for an agricultural crop irrigator that repetitively and egregiously continued to pump groundwater in kind of that northwestern Minnesota part of the state after repeated communications, other enforcement tools by our local conservation officers to stop pumping. Eventually, we issued and used that administrative penalty order, and that had a maximum fine at the time of $20,000 that was issued to that water user. But it is forgivable as long as they pursue compliance through applying for a permit. And so that was forgiven in that case. The other situation they may be familiar with was the appropriation associated with the Line 3 construction, pipeline construction. In those instances, again, that was water that was seeping, breached from underground aquifers that was also unpermitted. And so those were 2 instances where we've used that tool. For the over appropriation, that's where I said this most recent 2021 year, no compliance strategies implemented in those situations. We've communicated to both agricultural crop industries and all our permittees about staying within the limits of their permit. But we're hopeful with the recent legislation that was passed that adds and provides us a little bit other tools like schedules of compliance, stipulation agreements, civil penalties, for some of these egregious and repetitive violators to be able to use these other tools.
Great, thank you, Dan. It looks like the next question is from Kevin. Does anyone have a ballpark estimate of FTEs invested by public water authorities and state agencies that are working on water conservation? What dollar amount annually, if drought times and not, are invested in prevention approaches here in Minnesota?
I mean, fair question, Kevin. Thanks. We do have in our group, I also work with 2 other colleagues, one that works on more water policy and then one that works on water conservation. I'm a little bit more in the water regulation world. So we do have some additional dedicated folks, but I mean, a fair question. Some local municipalities do have folks that work on conservation efficiency efforts, whether it's water suppliers, the water operators at localities. Businesses obviously do and have made changes, but numbers and FTEs, I don't know offhand. I mean, really good question. I don't know, Ellen, if you have anything else to add to that.
Dan, I think you know about as much as me. I think the DNR has at least about 1 FTE dedicated to topics of conservation and drought. Not sure about others.
But yeah, just like Ellen emphasized, really a lot of this, interferences out of water situations can be prevented, right? Through not only our responsibility to regulate appropriately for what, the aquifer can handle, prevent by doing good application review and analysis before we issue a permit to understand, are there, vulnerable domestic wells in the area? Are there other impacts that may occur due to the high capacity appropriation? So that, yeah, there are certainly preventive measures and improved communication that not only DNR can do, but obviously, other supporting agencies.
All right, thank you. So we do have another question here from Dennis. Does surface drainage or tile drainage have any impact on groundwater recharge?
Well, this seems like a question for me. I think this is an area where we have a gap in our knowledge. Intuitively, as a hydrogeologist, it seems like Probably, right? That's changing your water balance. If anybody has papers or studies that are underway or that have happened on this topic, I'd be very interested in that.
Yeah, wasn't it, Ellen, the Groundwater Association of
Minnesota
Minnesota
Groundwater
had a white
Association did a
paper
white
that
paper on.
pretty much said just what you said. Yeah.
Correct. Yeah. I will add, I mean, I've been out to Northwest Minnesota, and it is very striking to see the conversion of prairie land to farmland, and it involves drilling a big well and putting in drain tile. The two go hand in hand these days.
Great, thank you. We have another question here. What's the story about large-scale potato farming on sandy previous soils in previously forested tracts in western Minnesota and their heavy water usage?
Well, we could have a colleague certainly join your group here sometime if you're interested in more specifics on that in particular. You know, we do have information on our webpage about that. I don't know as much specifics. You know, a time in like 2015, there were a lot of applications for groundwater appropriation in that area that we know as Pineland Sands near Park Rapids, Minnesota. And there was a EAW that was initiated in that area. I don't remember if it was offhand, if it was, I can't think of the term now, demanded. And so that changed temporarily the number of requests that were moved along essentially through the process. But yeah, I mean, I think there's no doubt, Kevin, that certainly land use changes have occurred in that area. We don't have that land use authority necessarily, but what we do at the DNR is can evaluate the availability of aquifers to handle that demand then that has changed in a particular area of the state, right? And so we certainly do have interest in those land use changes, but it is kind of a unique situation. I don't know if Ellen can add any more.
Well, I was just going to add, you know, we hear from growers, you know, and this isn't to take one side or another, but just a fact, those potato contracts are very, very lucrative. So if you get a potato, you might have you can't grow potatoes repeatedly on the same field, but you might have a potato contract one year, and then that's your profit on that field for the next 5 years, because you're not going to make as much money growing corn or soybeans or alfalfa or edible beans or whatever. So that's, you know, kind of the reality of the marketplace that farmers are living in. And I see Mindy wrote here about the status of hydrogeologic atlases. Thank you, Mindy. That was kind of the elephant in the room that I didn't explicitly call out. We are starting to get more geologic atlases in the western part of the state, but in some parts of the state, we are kind of flying blind.
And then it looks like we've got another question here from Carl. By mid-century in Minnesota, July is expected to receive less precipitation than it historically has, which will likely cause additional need for irrigation. What are some ways to deal with this potential worsening of conditions? Are there lessons we can learn from the Western U.S.?
Yeah, for sure. Great question. I know Ellen's has something to say here too. And I'll just start by saying, you know, from the regulatory program perspective, you know, we need to be better, right? And continue to be better at the work we do in reviewing applications, performing our analysis to understand the aquifer availability, the demands, the potential for increased demands. And then we need to continue to have conversations and work with the industry to be more efficient with use, right? And we know it's out there. I mean, if you go to Kansas or Nebraska, you know, if we're talking about agricultural crop irrigation, they are using less water because they have no choice there, right? And so it's out there, it's available. I mean, we occasionally hear about drip as an option for, you know, commodity crops too. Ellen, I'll let you talk. I know we're running short here.
Yeah, I wanted to add, I ran across, maybe others are familiar with this, I ran across something really fascinating, a study by Columbia University. Those of you who, you know, think about irrigation and kind of the settling of the West might be familiar with that idea of the 100th meridian. that was marked out by hydrographers. And the idea was that along the 100th meridian, which runs through about the center, north-south through the center of the Dakotas, if you're west of that, historically you needed to irrigate, and east of that, hydrographers said, oh, you probably don't need irrigation. Columbia University did a study which found that as a result of climate change, the 100th meridian, that idea of where you need to irrigate versus where you don't, has migrated. So the real 100th meridian, of course, still runs north-south through the Dakotas, but that irrigation, no irrigation line now runs through western Minnesota. And we are seeing a huge growth in ag irrigation permits in western Minnesota. And I think that's part of the reason why. So what I think, Carl, what I'm saying is that I think we're already seeing a little bit of what you described in your question.
Great, thank you. And then looks like we've got not a question, but a comment from Michael about if you want to see more focused information about the lack of groundwater information in western Minnesota, North Dakota worked on some airborne electromagnetic surveys up and down the North Dakota side of the Red River Valley that really highlights the spatial heterogeneity of aquifers. And then there is a link for anyone who's interested to that. And then we've got a comment here from Kevin that MPCA is putting a much bigger emphasis on prevention approaches and climate and environmental education and outreach. Maybe water conservation is a rich opportunity for an interagency initiative. Let's talk. So
Great.
if you
Thanks,
don't
Kevin.
already have Kevin's contact information, maybe Kevin, you can drop your email in the chat.
I've got it. I've got it. I've got it, Brooke. Yep.
All right, perfect. Let's see here. What's next? Mindy shared a link for that white paper, I think, that was discussed. Yeah. And a comment about loving our French fries here in America. Here we go. Question from Kathy. Is DNR still working on these pilot areas for evaluating how best to manage water appropriations?
Yeah, thanks for that mention. So those are our groundwater management areas that we've established. There's 3 of them. Plus we have a couple sustainable use management areas as well. That's not the full groundwater management area work, but it's still where we're focusing on appropriations as it relates to either surface water impacts and natural resources protections and sensitive resources out there. So yeah, so we've got the North and East Metro groundwater management area that's I'm project manager of. We've got the Straight River groundwater management area, which is around that Pineland Sands and Park Rapids area. And excuse me, and then we have the Bonanza Valley groundwater management area, like the Bruton, Belgrade, Rosa area in central Minnesota. So that's where we're taking a closer look at permitted pumping. And typically, most times it's related to surface water impacts is what most of those situations are evaluating. But in the North and East Metro, it's also population growth, right, and demand on groundwater resources in general, and pollution impacts and contaminations, obviously, as well.
Great, thank you, Dan. So there are a few other comments and some links to more reports and maps that all of you can click on and check out. I just want to get to this one last question that we have here from April, and then I think we will wrap it up here since we are 2 minutes after. It says, much of the earlier part of the presentation emphasized the state statutes and protection of water resources in current and future generations. What are the intersections between the Clean Water Act and the responsibilities of MPCA and DNR in water quality through the water appropriations permit?
Yeah, great question, April. We've talked a little bit about this. This is outlined in statute as well, that the DNR for sustainable groundwater use and availability needs to consider water quality. And that's about the amount of language that's in statute. And so in most situations, we're working locally with our PCA context, health context, Department of Ag context to understand what that water quality issue is, and then how can we prevent either exacerbating that issue through our water appropriation regulatory program and the permits we issue, or permit revisions we need to make based on that new information, for example. Yep, great question.
All right, well, thank you to both of you, Dan and Ellen, for taking time out of your schedules to be with us today and share your very important work. And there's any future updates or side topics like that climate change one, we're always looking for future presenters. So let us know if you want to come back and share any updates with us in the future. But thanks again for sharing your work with us and being here with us this morning.
Sure.
Thanks,
Yep.
Dan and Ellen. That was a really informative talk. Learned a lot. Thanks for being with us.
For having us.
Thanks, everybody. Yep. Let us know if there's more questions. Feel free to reach out.